Hello and welcome. I am Esra Akcan, a professor in the Department of Architecture and the director of the Institute for European Studies at the Unhcr Center for International Studies at Cornell University. Thank you for joining our webinar, North to South, Repair and Reparations for Climate Refugees. I would like to start by extending my sincere thanks to all our 5 speakers for accepting my invitation, and to our program manager, Pamela Hampton, and administrative assistant, Jason Ford, who have been flawlessly organizing this series. And let me also thank our student workers and ambassadors, Alp Demiroğlu, Meili Burks, Natalia Gulik, and Andrew Lim, who helped with social media posts, graphic design, and student participation. Before I introduce today's panel, let me acknowledge that this event is organized by Cornell University that is located on the lands of the Cayuga Nation. The Cayuga Nation is part of the alliance of 6 sovereign nations with a historic and contemporary presence on this land. They precede the establishment of Cornell University, New York State, and the United States of America. I acknowledge the painful history of dispossession and honor the ongoing connection of the Cayuga Nation's people, past and present, to these lands and waters. This panel is organized as part of IES migration series that has been continuing since fall 2017. We have organized panels to understand the historical and contemporary relevance of migration and to critically acknowledge Europe's role in the history of modernization and colonization, as well as its character as an immigrant continent. The theme of our series in this academic year has been repair and reparations. We have been thinking together about several aspects of this theme in today's context, as the question of reparations has a newfound relevance in the United States with the Black Lives Matter movement, as the current public health and related crises continue to produce anxiety, and moreover, as the question of repairs from climate change-related disasters looms in our planet's future. So far, we have heard presentations on the political misuse of cultural heritage, on reconstructions after deadly explosions and collapses, on the need for reparations for not only war crimes and totalitarian regimes, but also colonialism, slavery, and detainment, on the repatriation and restitution of museum objects that have been taken into collections by violence or deceit during colonial times, and on the amends to victims of nuclear disasters. This panel brings these topics to bear on the question of ecocide and reparations to current and future climate refugees. The same year, in 1825, when Thomas Telford finished constructing the world's first suspension bridge in England, which daringly displayed the technological possibilities of the Industrial Revolution, Britain accounted for 80% of the global emissions of carbon dioxide from fossil fuels. Abundant examples of this kind show the impact of the Industrial Revolution and fossil economy on the history of the built environment. The energy transition to fossil fuels and the resulting economy that depended on the continuous growth of production and carbon dioxide emissions has made humanity a major geophysical force on the planet. And yet the fossil economy was barely a species-wide invention or endorsed by the entire humanity. This energy transition arose as a form of power exercised by some people against others, as Andreas Malm comprehensively analyzed in his book, Fossil Capital. Ever since, countries and peoples that did not have much agency in deciding about this energy transition suffered most from it. For decades, companies dumped their toxic chemicals and fossil fuel combustion in colonized and poorer countries. 2 centuries later today, we find ourselves in a world where the displacement of populations due to climate change forecasts an unprecedented phenomenon in human history. Neither international law nor nations are prepared to face up to the human cost of this challenge in a way that would secure refugees' human rights or their appropriate resettlement. How is it possible to think of restitutions to climate refugees by acknowledging the accountability of the first industrializing countries of the global north in imposing this displacement on the peoples of the global south? Can we think of rehabilitation and subsidized resettlement as a form of reparation to current and future climate refugees. The intention of this panel is to start a conversation with scholars working in the areas of migration, transitional justice, art, architecture, landscape, and environmental humanities on the possibility of a just response to displacement of climate refugees. One of the starting points of this Repair and Reparation series at Cornell is the acknowledgement of the intertwined histories of capitalism, racism, colonialism, and environmental extraction. The intersectionality of the crimes against individuals, groups, nations, and the planet has prompted this series to discuss the repairs and reparations against these wounds and injuries together. Fittingly today, we have a multidisciplinary group of speakers who see clearly and analyze succinctly the intersectional dimensions of the planetary environmental crisis. First, we will hear from Ashley Dawson, whose book Extreme Cities showed the vulnerability of cities in the age of climate change, particularly port cities along water and urban centers of the global south are being disproportionately affected by the environmental disasters. In his classic book, Planet of Slums of 2005, Mike Davis had exposed the relation between neoliberalism and destitute living conditions in big cities, while Ashley triangulates neoliberalism, urban deprivation, and climate change in his own books that have become major references for anyone interested in environmentalism, urbanity, and the sacrifice zones of neoliberalism. Then we will hear from and see the work of Mcclintock. As you know, ecocide is slow violence, and the most distinguishing character of slow violence is its invisibility, unlike more visible and commonly acknowledged forms of violence. How can visual disciplines, photography, architecture, graphic design, make slow violence visible while challenging the visibility of the visible? Anne's work that we will see partially today, Monster, brings us face to face with melting ice, rising waters, and the mass displacement of peoples and other species. Her works aim to make the great planetary upheavals tangible, real, and imaginable, so as better to be able to devise strategies for change. Third, we will hear from Bronwyn Lebo. Discussing climate change and refugees together allows us to see the dimensions of international law. Many attorneys and organizations have been campaigning to make ecocide an international crime, which can be carried to the International Criminal Court, equitable to crimes against humanity and war crimes. First used in relation to the Vietnam War and the US military of toxic chemical warfare, the term ecocide has not been recognized or ratified as an international crime, even though this was proposed already in the first UN Conference on the Environment in Stockholm in 1972. Who are the perpetrators and who are the victims of ecocide? Discussing environmental crisis as a topic of transitional justice and international law will also link this panel to this series on reparations to not only war crimes, but also to residual inequalities caused by slavery, colonization, and extraction. And our final two speakers will carry us back to the built environment and the disciplines of architecture and landscape design. The realization of ecological problems as socially, geopolitically, and architecturally caused conflicts has brought planning and design to the forefront. After Bronwyn's discussion about the status of climate refugees under international law, we will hear from Anu Siddiqui, whose work speaks to us from the refugee spaces themselves and raises the voice of the refugees themselves. Her forthcoming book analyzes the Unhcr refugee housing complex in Kenya and traces histories of the long encounter between architecture and humanitarianism, as well as the formation of the architectures of aid as a professional field. Finally, Billy Fleming will comment on the possibility, or rather, probably impossibility of reparative landscape design. I anticipate this will not be a comforting ending, as Billy's article, Design and the Green New Deal, starts with the following sentence, I'm quoting, "I don't know when the myth of landscape architects as climate saviors began, but I know it is time to kill it." He has criticized the genre of self-important design writing that often takes the form of publicity about landscape design's exceptionalism. Instead, Billy calls for a much broader collaborative effort and a radical public policy. Each of our 5 speakers will make a 15-minute presentation. Upon conclusion of these presentations, there will be a discussion and a Q&A when I will make a selection of questions submitted from the attendees. You will be able to submit your questions for this portion by writing them in the Q&A tool that you can find at the bottom of your screen. Given the large size of attendees, please make your questions direct and refrain from writing your reactions or impressions so that I can sort through the questions efficiently. And we hope to conclude the panel in less than 2.5 hours in total. So I'm very much looking forward to all these presentations and the following discussion. And let me now introduce our first speaker. Ashley Dawson is Professor of Postcolonial Studies in the English Department at the Graduate Center, City University of New York, and the College of Staten Island. He's the author of numerous books, including People's Power, Reclaiming the Energy Commons, Extreme Cities, The Peril and Promise of Urban Life in the Age of Climate Change, and Extinction, A Radical History. A member of the Social Text Collective and the founder of the CUNY Climate Action Lab, he's a longtime climate justice activist. He's currently at work on a book entitled Environmentalism from Below, and with the Environmental Humanities Lab in Stockholm on the creation of a global network of organizations devoted to radical people's planning for climate action. Ashley, the screen is yours.
Thank you so much, Esra. I really appreciate the invitation to speak today, and really appreciated your powerful introduction to the panel. I also wanted to thank Pamela, Jason, and all the other people who have made today's event possible. So let me start screen sharing and start my presentation up. Okay, great. So I wanted to begin by talking about something specific that happened last summer. I was invited by the architect and filmmaker Liam Young to participate in a project of his called Planet City. This is a still from a film he made. As you can see, he was imagining the retreat of all of humanity into one hyperdense metropolis housing the entire population of Earth. So in other words, a future of global climate migration that encompasses all of humanity. An interesting project. I'll come back to it later in my presentation when I discuss architecture and climate migration. But before going into all of that, I want to outline what I'll be talking about and also sort of step back a little bit from the topic. So, the first part of my presentation will be about what climate migration is. I think it's a political football, and the takeaway point from what I'll be presenting is that there needs to be a fight against the increasing appropriation of the figure of the climate refugee by right-wing forces, particularly eco-fascism, and that the climate justice movement needs to position itself unequivocally against that appropriation. And I think there are 2 important ways to do that. One is to insist on the right to stay, and the other is to insist on the right to move. And I will be talking about both of those things in the second and third parts of my presentation. Okay, so what is climate migration and what is a climate refugee? Well, on some level, it's fairly simple. Climate refugees are people who are forced to evacuate their territories because of climate change. That sounds simple, but climate refugees are both invisible and hypervisible at the same time. Why invisible? Well, there is no international right for climate refugees. The Geneva statutes don't recognize climate refugees. And as a result of that, essentially climate refugees are juridically invisible, but at the same time, they are hypervisible. So the map you see below is from 2005, when the United Nations Environmental Program issued a warning that a whopping 50 million people could become climate refugees by 2010. And they published this map, which, as you can see, links displacement overwhelmingly to global South nations. So the accounts then went on to get even more sort of sensationalistic. This is a Christian Aid report from 2017 with the kind of lurid rhetoric of a swelling human tide of refugees. Now, the point of this kind of reporting was to argue that wealthy countries needed to mitigate carbon emissions dramatically in order to prevent mass displacement. So, you know, a positive outcome that is in line with climate science, and yet the rhetoric here very much dovetailed with some of the highly problematic Malthusian rhetorics of the climate movement historically. So this is Paul Ehrlich's book, The Population Bomb, from the early 1970s, which was co-published with the Sierra Club. This strand of environmental thinking in dominant groups like the Sierra Club prevailed until the 1980s and is still circulating in some quadrants of the environmental movement today. It very quickly got taken up by the military. So, you know, the goal of mitigating carbon emissions and the kind of rhetoric about potential displacement from the global south to the global north very quickly became a security concern that the US military was able to parlay into increasing funding or claims for increasing funding. Starting in the mid-1980s. And what you see here is one of the most recent assessments in which historic levels of human displacement and the negative effects of environmental degradation and climate change are specified as key elements of worldwide threats in the threat assessment. And it's not just the imperial US state, which is using the specter of climate refugees. In addition, there's a growing strain of extra-state eco-fascism, which is embracing various different forms of green rhetoric. So for instance, the Christchurch killer in New Zealand argued that immigration is essentially a form of ecological warfare, and the El Paso killer in the United States subsequently went on to argue that we need to get rid of enough people to make our lifestyle sustainable. The people he killed evidence what kinds of people he was thinking of. So underlying these kinds of rhetorics are eugenicist models fueled by apocalyptic nihilism and race war fantasies. And in the United States, these have been very much evident in the QAnon conspiracy theory, which is linked to the storming of the US Capitol. You see here on the right, Jake Angeli, who's now in prison and who is a vegan and environmentalist as well as a white supremacist. And in the European Union, there are similar kinds of strands. For instance, Marine Le Pen, who is a well-known far-right figure, has espoused a form of green nationalism in which she compares migrants to foreign invasive species and argues that borders will save the planet. So we see a kind of escalation of border militarism linked to eco-fascism. And all of this is tied to completely false information. And this is a point which is really key to hammer home. You know, there must be a dismantling of this kind of rhetoric through really understanding what the numbers are. If we look at the numbers, nearly twice as many people are internally displaced. In other words, they stay within their countries of origin as cross borders. So the kind of specter of migration from the global south to the global north is one that is largely invented. And particularly if you look further down on this chart, you'll see that roughly 85% of refugees are hosted in developing countries, right? So they don't end up in the global north. In addition to that, the causes of displacement are complex and compound. So this image from the Internal Displacement Monitoring Center underlines that roughly 45 million people are displaced as a result of violent conflicts. And you can see that most of this happens in global south countries. A much smaller number are displaced by disasters, environmental disasters of various different kinds. But the IDMC disaggregates these two different figures. And it's important to keep in mind, though, that violent conflicts are often connected to environmental disasters of various different kinds and forms of slow violence, like droughts linked to climate change. The science of attribution is still developing around all of this, but it's often hard to make direct one-to-one connections here. So we need to unpack all of these figures and much of the scaremongering that goes on around them. And all of that suggests is to suggest that the figure of the climate refugee needs to be unpacked. Academic analysis can play a really important role in that. But in addition, anti-fascist social movements are going to play an extremely important role in resisting the rise of eco-fascism and its rhetoric, which is manipulating the figure of the climate refugee. And environmental movements need to stay away from this kind of rhetoric, I would argue, given the way it's been instrumentalized. Okay, I want to think about what the climate justice movement should be doing if it's going to pivot away from this problematic history that I've just outlined. And the way I want to do that is through first talking about the right to stay. So how are people displaced? Well, one important measure and cause of displacement is debt and economic immiseration. It's worth keeping in mind that debt burdens across the global South have skyrocketed since the 2008 global financial crisis, in large part due to the boom in private sector debt and debt creating public-private partnerships. And this public debt has taken on an increasingly deadly role in the context of the pandemic. As a result of that, there's been a campaign to drop the debt because many of the fiscally poorest countries are already spending more on repaying their debt than they are on their public health systems and on their life-saving public services. So in this sense, debt literally kills, and it also displaces people in all sorts of different ways. Now, the G20 and the IMF have suspended debt payments for the poorest countries, but these agreements fail to mandate action for private creditors like commercial banks and investment funds, or for multilateral development banks like the World Bank. And meanwhile, middle-income countries, where the vast majority of the world's poor people reside, are not receiving debt relief in any form. So clearly, one of the ways in which we can help people stay where they are is to campaign to drop the debt and to dismantle all the systems of international trade that help to foster debt. And I want to turn back for a second to think about campaigns that have advanced these kinds of demands and a whole contrarian set of goals. By turning for a second to the Cochabamba Declaration from 2010, it came out of the World People's Conference on Climate Change and the Rights of Mother Earth in Cochabamba, Bolivia. I was fortunate enough to be invited to participate in a delegation of environmental justice activists from New York to Cochabamba, and so was there when the Cochabamba Declaration was crafted. And for me, it remains one of the most important documents and important sort of rallying cries behind which radical movements can organize. One of the key ideas advanced by the Cochabamba Declaration is the idea of climate debt. So the declaration states that we, the people of the world attending the conference, demand to the countries that have overconsumed the atmospheric space to acknowledge their historic and current responsibilities for the causes and adverse effects of climate change and honor their climate debts to developing countries. And there were various different types of climate debt that were enumerated by the attendees at the conference, including development debt, adaptation debt, and migration debt. And all of this is important if we keep in mind historic debt for carbon emissions. So this chart gives you a bit of a sense of historic responsibility for carbon emissions, although it does give a bit of a false impression because it, of course, includes a large chunk of emissions from China. And we need to remember that wealthy nations like the United States and the members of the European Union have offshored much of their industrial production to China over the last 4 decades or so, so that much of China's emissions are connected to production for consumption in the EU and the United States. Here's just another image which kind of graphically gives you a sense of who is historically responsible for climate change. So what are some of the demands of these countries that are historically culpable for emissions, demands that emerged from the Cochabamba process? One of the key demands was to decolonize the atmosphere by reducing and removing emissions. Another was to facilitate adequate responses to climate change and to meet the costs of its adverse effects in global South countries. Another was to develop and provide appropriate technologies and knowledge. In other words, local technologies and capacities. The struggle for agroecology instead of industrial agriculture is an example of this kind of appropriate and local knowledge that the Cochabamba attendees called for. And then another demand was to enable technology transfer. And I think this is particularly important today as we see Green New Deals being advanced in countries like the United States that envisage beefing up renewable technology in order to make countries like the US more competitive on international terrain. Now, all of these demands did have an impact on international climate negotiations. In fact, in 2013, the Warsaw International Mechanism on Loss and Damage was instituted at the United Nations Conference of Parties, the annual climate convention. However, it was essentially gutted by the Paris Agreement, where powerful nations like the United States adamantly insisted that there be no culpability for historic emissions. Because of all of this, I think we need to also think about the right to move, and this is the final part of my presentation. I want to show you a bit of a clip of the film that I mentioned at the outset, the work of Liam Young, Planet City, just to give you a sense of how some architects are thinking about these issues and about movement today. I'll stop that clip here because of time. I'll just say that Liam Young is not the only architect thinking about these issues. Vanessa Keith's book, 2100, A Dystopian Utopia, also thinks along similar lines. She maps out the areas that are no longer going to be habitable and projects areas that will be habitable and creates pairs of extraction cities where skeletal populations will remain, places like Manila and New York City, and links them to compact megacities that will be developed in places like Greenland. And she does this for both hemispheres. And she projects what kinds of technologies will be used in these new cities. Now, this is really fascinating and important to think about, but I think that there's a bit of a tendency here to fetishize built space and not to think about radical demands for climate justice and for the right to move that would make it possible to contemplate moving to these places and to overcome the forms of eco-fascism that I already outlined earlier in this presentation. So I want to take us back for a second to the Cochabamba Declaration and think about their idea of migration debt. So attendees at the Cochabamba meeting demanded political, economic, social, and cultural patterns in which the right to move and displace freely is respected. They demanded the promotion of a human rights treaty for climate migrants, and that's to deal with the kind of juridical invisibility of climate refugees that I outlined earlier. And they also demanded the creation of an economic fund bankrolled by countries in the center of capitalism and huge transnational corporations that would facilitate climate migration. These demands are still, I think, the cutting edge demands for social movements, and the climate justice movement demands, I think, that we need to keep hammering home as the climate emergency bites increasingly deeply. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Ashley, for your cautionary remarks, as well as the need for a much clearer and less instrumentalized definition of the climate refugee, and also for bringing the right to stay, climate debt, and migration debt as concepts of a reparative movement. That was wonderful. Thank you so much. So next we have Anne Mcclintock, who holds the Barton Hepburn Chair in Gender and Sexuality Studies and the Environmental Humanities at Princeton University. She's a writer, photographer, and activist who is the author of the best-selling Imperial Leather, among other texts, including Dangerous Liaisons, Gender, Nation, and Postcolonial Perspectives, and also a monograph on Simone de Beauvoir. She co-edited Queer Transactions of Race, Nation, and Gender, as well as Sex Workers and Sex Work. She has written and reprinted over 100 articles and essays, and her work has been translated to 16 languages. Her creative essays and photographs have appeared in The Guardian, New York Times, Times Literary Supplement, The Nation, eFlux, Village Voice, among others. Her academic articles have appeared in Critical Inquiry, Transition, and Boundary 2, among others. She has won numerous awards, including 2 MacArthur Fellowships, a Distinguished Human Rights Fellowship, Feminist Scholars Award, Columbia Presidential Fellowship. Her interdisciplinary and transnational work explores the intersections between race, gender, and sexualities, imperialism and militarization, visual culture and mass media, as well as environmental justice, climate chaos, and animal studies. And it's to you.
Thank you so much for that welcome. I'm so deeply honored to be joining such an incredible panel of people today to discuss these globally urgent issues. What I'm going to talk about today is taken from my forthcoming book, Unquiet Ghosts, but so just a tiny fragment. And it's a piece of creative nonfiction that is enfolded around almost entirely my photographs. And I want it to be an immersive experience. So I'm going to show photographs and I won't have my icon on the side, but hopefully it will appear at the end. So let me just screen share and and I hope you can hear me. Let me know if you can't.
Yes, we can hear you.
Thank you. Monster, a fugue in fire and ice.
But we don't see your screen, if that's what you intend.
Oh, just hang on 1 second then. Hang on. Let me see how I can do that. Here we go. Hang on. That you should be able to see that now?
Yes.
Great, fantastic. Okay. Monster, a fugue in fire and ice. The word monster comes from Monera, to show or warn, by which gods give notice of calamity. Hence monstrous, premonition, demonstration, and monument. The word fugue comes from fugere or fugara, to flee from or chase, as in fleeing or chasing monsters or ghosts. Hence refugee, fugitive, refuge, and to fly. Today, my talk unfolds fugue-like three of the great crises of our time: climate chaos, global militarization, and the mass displacement of people and other species. We have entered an epoch of shocked space and torn time. The planet is awry. We awakened oil from its ancient slumber to fuel our own fossil dreams. We combusted the deep time of the past into an alchemy of black energy. Now the ice sheets are melting faster than ever thought possible. Greenland is vanishing. The ice is leaving Iceland. Lightning torches the tundra, turning permafrost into permafire. Firestorms so vast they are visible from space rage across Amazonia, Australia, California, and Siberia. Farmers watch mile-high dust storms rub out the sky. In Harare, Zimbabwe, the taps run dry. The great burnings of the trees, the vanishing of the bees, and everywhere the stealthy rising of the seas. But the established circuits that connect these great crises have been ghosted. How do we record a history of forgetting? How do we write a history of fragments? And how do we then account for and be accountable to the violently forgotten, displaced, and erased? And in particular, how can we understand these great planetary upheavals of the Anthropocene unless we also understand their beginnings in the long arc and of the violent foundations of the enslavement of peoples, near genocides of native and indigenous peoples, and the great ecocides of what I call invasive colonialism? How do we live in fugue times? Fugue 1, Refugee. And this fragment is from Dawson's great poem called Home. You have to understand that no one puts their children in a boat unless the water is safer than the land. No one leaves home unless home is a sweaty voice in your ear saying, leave, run away from me now. I don't know what I've become, but I know that anywhere is safer than here. In 2015, at the height of the arrival of 500,000 displaced people into Europe, a men's clothing shop in Izmir, Turkey began selling orange life jackets alongside its regular menswear. Izmir served as a hub for refugees as well as a boomtown for business. This New York Times photograph of the shop is both striking and chilling in how nonchalantly the shop window stages a false equivalence between the models on the right wearing orange life jackets and the identical models on the left wearing black and navy business jackets, as if displaced people from the global south, desperately dressed for survival, can, with the exchange of cash, like the man tucking his wallet in his pocket, pass through the open door of the unregulated free market economy, be rescued from calamity, and instantly dressed for success. The shop window stages the false promise of global south to global north upliftment, the free market that will raise all lifeboats ethos. But the black hole of the rubber tube in the window and the chaos of life jackets at the back of the store create visual disturbances that point to a spectral violence. In Izmir, the dark secret is the booming multi-billion-dollar rescue economy, an illegal smuggling infrastructure and factories churning out inflatable life jackets and rafts. The inadmissible crime is that the life jackets are made from materials like foam that do not float, but absorb water, potentially drowning rather than rescuing the refugees. The New York Times article that accompanies the photograph is, like neoliberalism itself, awash with watery words. Migrants are flooding, a human tide is rushing, money is pooling, cash is pouring, outflows and overflows. It's a perfect storm, says Demetrios Papadimitriou, president of the Migration Policy Institute. These watery words obscure the migrant calamity, as well as the profits garnered by the pirates of peri-capitalism and the overlords of austerity, as a fiat of nature, a tidal result of natural causes. Nature becomes thereby the alibi and accomplice of the inequities of austerity. And I'm recalling what Ash Dawson has just said about migrant tidal flows. But as Arundhati Roy notes, trickle down hasn't worked, but gush up certainly has. What the article also obscures, however, is that the majority of the people that arrived that summer in Turkey were from Afghanistan, Iraq, and Syria. The shattered revenants of the illegal US wars of occupation that both caused and converged with the accelerating crises of climate breakdown and mass displacement. Our epoch is characterized by a fatal convergence, the political coming to dominance of neoliberal austerity and what I call corporate fascism that has both caused and converged with accelerating climate breakdown. And we would do well to remember that militarization is the largest single cause of environmental havoc in the world. The US military is the largest single cause of conflict in the world, and the US Department of Defense is the largest single consumer of oil in the world. By the end of 2019, close to 80 million people were forcibly displaced, 68 million by armed conflict or persecution. Every 3 seconds, somewhere in the world, a person is displaced. But what I mean by displacement is not merely the violent removal of people and other species from place. I also mean displacement as quite literally the removal of place. That is, loss of place in place, manifest in what I call ghostscapes or ghost ecologies. Violently damaged landscapes such as melting ice caps, the felled trees and forest infernos in Amazonia, trees torched for palm oil plantations, fraying wetlands and toxic wastelands, and the rising oceans of this blue planet we are slowly undoing. Seeing displacement as both removal from place and removal of place invites us to consider forced mobility as the spectral double of forced immobility. Millions of the global poor and dispossessed are either forcibly on the move or forcibly immobilized, incarcerated in refugee camps, detention centers, and island prisons like Nauru, Australia, webbed into the invisible surveillance systems of carceral modernity that now spread their filaments around the world. And this photograph in The Guardian captures the visible failure of the neoliberal promise in the earlier New York Times image, a spectral double where now migrants in orange life jackets are flanked not by men in business suits, but by health officials in white COVID hazmat suits. View 2, premonition, ice at the end of the world. I am flying. It's the summer of 2012 and I'm flying over Greenland. Far below lies an unearthly landscape. Something looks beautifully, surreally wrong. But what is it? Greenland's mountains are sloughing off their ancient sheath of snow. The icy tongues of the glaciers are thinning. The bony ribs of the earth are visible to the sun for the first time in 100,000 years. 2012 was the Goliath year of climate change, and it was all about the ice. But one fact towered above the rest, the colossal melt of Greenland. In mid-July, scientists stared at statistics so staggering, they thought at first there must be some mistake. Satellite images showed that in 4 days alone, 97% of the massive mountainous surface of Greenland had melted from white to dark. Snow cover, part of which had been frozen for 18 million years, had thawed into a colossal sheen of ice water. Scientists were stunned. Ice surface the size of the United States had disappeared. This is unprecedented, said James Wally, a glaciologist at NASA. To have melt cover the whole of Greenland, he said, is unknown. Panicked, polar research teams crunched the numbers and agreed. Ice melt had caused 20% of global sea level rise since 1992, and most of the melt was from Greenland. The Arctic ice domes had shrunk to their smallest size in recorded history, melting 3 times faster than anywhere on Earth, 7 times faster than in the 1990s. Icy torrents roar down sapphire abysses called moulins, unmaking the ice sheets from below. By century's end, Glacier Park will have no glaciers. Iceland may well be iceless land, and the snows of Mount Kilimanjaro will be gone. The ice sheets are our giant mirrors, cooling the earth in a process called albedo. As humans overheat the planet, the ice melts faster, and as it melts, it darkens and absorbs more heat, and the great thaw speeds into a fateful feedback spiral. And as the ice melts, the oceans rise, and as the oceans warm, they rise. But what filled scientists with dread in 2012 was not merely the immensity of the great melt, but that something unforeseen and catastrophic had been set in motion that could not now be stopped. Why does this matter? The melting of Greenland has been called the greatest geological change to reshape the planet in human history. But the Great Melt is abstract. Greenland is the largest island in the world, stretching the vertical length of the United States. Scientists tell us the ice is 2 miles deep at its center. They tell us this massive ice cube contains a dizzying 3 quadrillion tons of solid water. That is a 3 with 15 zeros. And they estimate when all this ice melts, global sea levels might probably rise by 24 feet, unleashing a planetary cataclysm that will displace 350 million people by the next few decades, drowning the coastlines and megacities of human civilization that took millennia to make, undoing and reshaping the world. But one problem is not precision. Problem is perception. We can't see the scale and time of climate threat. Our minds are not suited for picturing ice caps melting, the tininess of nitrogen change, and billions of people learning to lead amphibious lives. And if we can't picture it, how can we act to prevent it? So one of the first challenges, it's not the greatest, but it's certainly a profound one. One of the first challenges of transformative restitution is how to make these great planetary upheavals visible, tangible, and real. The better to devise viable strategies for a sustainable and collective global survival. And now myriad artists, activists, scientists across the world are reaching for new and creative ways to express the inexpressible, make the invisible visible, the unthinkable tangible and real. And as my plane flies on, leaving Greenland and carbon trails behind us, spirals of ice spin across the sea like a galaxy of spilled stars. The future is now, but the future has arrived at different times for different people. 650 million people are threatened with displacement by century's end. 48 island nations are threatened by rising seas. The Maldives are drowning. Tuvalu and Kiribati are soon to go. Climate chaos, once seen as comfortingly far away and measured in centuries, is now measured in decades, but is already endured by millions as the ordinary disasters of the everyday, whether in the black-water slums of Lagos, the fluid streets of Jakarta, or the drowning of southern Louisiana in the Gulf of Mexico. This is my last fragment, Q3, Ile de Jean Charles, Atlas of a Drowning World. Louisiana is the fastest disappearing land on Earth. The lush wetlands teem with fish and wildlife, but every hour land the size of a football field will vanish and become open water. In other words, during the time of this panel, 2 football fields of land will go underwater. And there you can see in this map, the land loss in red over the last few decades. Deep in the southern marshes, the Biloxi Chidimo Choctaw tribe cling to a vanishing shard of land. It was once the size of Manhattan, but the island is now 2 miles long and a quarter of a mile wide. With the next big hurricane, the island could go, its name washed from the map forever. I am flying. At my side, the island seems to be flying too, a half hallucinatory bird, its eyes pointing to the far horizon. But one wing seems caught in the melt of the faraway ice caps, and the island bird breathes water. A single road tethers the island to the world, so thin and broken that when the great storms surge, the road drowns underwater, sometimes leaving the people marooned for years. The inhabitants of Ile de Jean Charles have been called widely by the global media the first federally funded climate refugees in the United States. In 2016, the state of Louisiana won a $48 million federal grant to relocate them to a suburban settlement further inland. And the media of the world is waiting to see how they do it. And I'd be very happy in question time to talk about what I see as the failure and what they see as the failure of the settlement. In talking to the islanders, this is Chris and Juliet Brunet Choctaw, as well as to Chief Albert Nakan Choctaw and other tribal members of the island, I found a more troubling story emerging. The islanders are caught in a fateful paradox, not only between rising waters, and wanting to stay, what Ash calls the right to stay. The paradox of being caught not only between rising waters and wanting to stay on their island, but also being hailed as climate refugees, but they are not federally recognized as existing in the first place. And that's one of the reasons they couldn't apply for federal funding, because they don't exist. The islanders' Choctaw forebears fled the 1830 Indian Removal Act, colonial cataclysm during which thousands of native people were driven off their lands east of the Mississippi to territories in the West. The Trail of Tears that followed enacted a double violence against both native people and enslaved Africans, as native lands were emptied to make way for sugar and cotton plantations. Some Choctaw fled the great removals and found refuge in marshes so abundant that they sustained themselves alongside Chinimacha, Biloxi, and Homer in peaceful solitude for nearly a century, until in the 1920s, the oil companies came, colonial déjà vu. Now the islanders are being driven from their homes by the same economic violence that drove their ancestors off their lands. I am flying. Below me, the vast wetlands are a ruined ghostscape. Companies drilling for oil have sliced and diced the vast fertile wetlands into ribbons. Rigs suck out the oil and the marshes sink. Canals draw salty tides into the wetlands and the vast forests die, bleached into ghost trees. The bodies of the land is hurt. Ragged strips float away like green scabs. The last tree on Island Road leans arthritically against the evening sky. Rising waters are floating the island away. And as the waters rise, the houses rise too, floating some 15 feet high. The water people are learning to lead skyborne lives. But some are refusing to leave the island, like Chief Albert Nakan's sister Denicia, who's 95 and will not leave, and Meg. They are refusing to be relocated. They are holding on with their fingertips to the frail scaffolding of their lives. As I leave Ile de Jean Charles, a churning storm erupts. Fishermen are refusing the storm. Their bodies gleam like fish. They are fishmen, breathers of water. They are dancing an ancient slow dance. They are learning to lead amphibious lives, casting their nets of hope. But in losing Ile de Jean Charles, the world is not just losing an island with an irrepressible community. The world is losing a lifeway, an indigenous ethic, an ethic of being beholden, of holding others, and knowing one will, in turn, be held. Coda, fugue futures. So I believe we must keep faith with fugue futures so that the past does not continue to wound the present. To read ghost ecologies only for their dark histories is another violence, disallowing the possibilities of resurgent life and generous, sustainable beauty. The challenges are immense. 630 million people predicted to be displaced. Mass displacement will call for massive funding, but it is in a world already gutted by the overlords of austerity and corporate fascism. Just relocations should recognize the risk that so-called managed retreat can all too easily become a spectral double of the forced removals, the nuclear and chemical toxicities, the great ecocides and genocides of invasive colonialism. And surely we have to think, as Ashley was gesturing in his talk, beyond the technocratic solutions, the monetary and fiscal means of reparation, which also risk rehearsing colonial legacies and recreating post-colonial inequities. Can we possibly rethink, and this is what I'm so interested in talking to you all about, can we possibly rethink what reparation might mean rather than individual financial recompense, which of course is necessary but not sufficient, and rethinking beyond accounting for linear descent from forebears inflicted from harm, which can also replicate colonial legacies of thinking, but think through radical transformative justice and social transformation. Just think, for one example, of universal healthcare in the United States. Transformative, I'm coming to an end, I've just got one short paragraph. Transformative reparations must attend to the cultural, racial, gendered impacts of the communities displaced and inundated. The needs of different communities differ around the globe. As Katrien Jacobs-de Keer, Prime Minister, said, Human rights, social justice, and gender equality are all intrinsically connected to the fight because climate change affects the poor more than the rich, the underprivileged more than the privileged, and women more than men. Relocation needs to be equitably distributed, community-led, and financially supported. There's a long history of unjust forced removals. Just relocations should engage how people can move without being stripped of their identities, their living cultures, their memories, their familiar livelihoods. Land is identity, memory is survival. Just reparation and relocation should recognize that cycles of retreat and return that displaced people often enact are sometimes the only means by which the precarious and the poor can resist being managed by states against their will and against their interest into unlivable circumstances like Ile-de-Jean Charles. Just reparations should keep alive the sovereign agency of community leaders, including women, children, the elderly, and disabled. Women are at the forefront of negotiations and decisions, but massively underrepresented in international formal forums. The challenges are immense and there are no easy answers, but the stakes have never been higher. The oceans and fires rise higher. And I've come to believe that if we begin with what we love, we might give grief and mourning their fullness. Grief makes us kin with what we mourn, and out of that kinship, radical transformation might more likely rise up. Protecting what Rachel Carson called the web of life is within our reach, not just for ourselves, but for the future strangers who will walk the future planet in our footsteps. Small acts have epochal effects. No act is too small to make a difference. The future is now. So we must learn to speak with ghosts, for specters disturb the administration of forgetting, and the hauntings of popular memory will return to challenge the great forgettings of official history. For as the writer Eduardo Galeano writes, history never really says goodbye. History says, see you later. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Anne, for these very powerful and moving photographs and words, and for making slow violence visible, and also honoring the stories of the refugees, as well as gesturing towards many questions that I hope we will be able to take up in the Q&A. So our next presentation will bring us to the topic of transitional justice. Bronwyn Lebo is Associate Professor of Political Science at the University of California, Riverside, where she's also affiliated with the Global Studies program. Her research focuses on environmental justice, transitional justice, the politics of memory, and environmental legacies of war. She's currently working on a book entitled After Slumber, Transformative Justice, Memories of Resistance, and the Lessons of the Past, which has been supported with a fellowship from the ALCS Foundation. Her 2011 book, Judging State-Sponsored Violence, Imagining Political Change, won the 2012 International Ethics Book Award from the International Studies Association. Yes.
Hi, everybody. Thank you so much for this invitation and for including me in this amazing event. I have just been so moved by the commentaries that I've heard so far, and really happy to be a part of this. I'm going to try to share my screen. Okay. I thought I'd be able to do this. Okay, I think I can do it. I'm so sorry for the delay here. And I'm just gonna get started while I wait for that to come up. So I was asked to contribute to the panel today by commenting on this theme of climate, refugees, and international law. And so my remarks I prepared as a bit more general than some of the, oh, that's weird looking. Do you think you could maybe make my face go away while I'm sharing? Is that something you have to do? Can I control that or?
Yeah, you may stop sharing your video.
Oh, okay. Okay. Is that okay? Okay. That's a little like less distracting for me. But everyone can still hear me. Okay. So my remarks are going to be a little bit more general than what was discussed at the beginning. And I wanted to start by reflecting on a series of images that went viral several years ago. Although this is not my area of expertise, as it is some of the other panelists in terms of art and images and space. But so I'm going to take some liberties and just discuss these images that I'm sure many of you have seen. If my slides will go forward, I'm not succeeding in moving my slide. It says 1 of 8. Huh. Okay. Maybe I should
can we show your slides?
Yeah, I just don't want to take any more time to send them. Let's see. That's not. Oh. You know,
if you like, we can have the next speaker while you are sending the slides. Is that okay?
Yeah, I would appreciate that. I'm so sorry. If that's okay, that would be a good idea. I'm so sorry. I thought I had this nailed down, but thank you.
Anu, maybe have you?
Okay, I'm unable to open my video. Sorry, Pamela. Various technical, okay. There I am.
Great. Let me introduce you. Originally the intention was to have climate refugees and international law, and then look at the refugees, hear from the refugees from the ground, but I'm sure this order will work equally well. So Anu Siddiqui was born in Chennai and is an assistant professor at Barnard College, Columbia University. She's writing 2 book manuscripts, Architecture of Migration, the Dadaab Refugee Camps and Humanitarian Settlement, which analyzes the history, visual rhetoric, and spatial politics of the refugee camps in northeastern Kenya as an epistemological vantage point in the African and Islamic world. And as well as another book on Minette Silva and a modern architecture of the past, which engages the intellectual and heritage work of one of the first women in the world to establish a professional architectural practice in Sri Lanka. I'm looking forward to our presentation.
Right, thank you so much. Hello to everyone. Thanks to Esra Akchan, Pamela Hampton, and Jason Ford, and my esteemed panelists. I agree with Bronwyn. I'm so moved by all that I've heard so far, so it's really wonderful to be here. I would also like to thank many refugees and aid workers for their insights and encouragement, which have refined my own learning. So my talk, my talk is called A Restitution of Academic Freedom, and I'll explain why this concerns climate refugees. Even after 11 years of scholarly intimacy with refugee contexts, I found myself reading and rereading the prompt that was sent to us for this panel. and a really remarkable prompt. It begins with the language of pragmatic, solution-oriented policy, only to disrupt it and turn on actionable, theory-oriented praxis. And I find this really radical and inspiring. The prompt admonishes the failure to secure refugees' human rights or their appropriate resettlement, and calling on all of us from these multiple academic disciplines, rather than just those who make policy or manage populations. It speaks in the language of reparation for something as elusive and unquantifiable as climate. And it also asks for reparation, not merely for existing people, but for those to come. So I was very moved by its demands for restitutions, accountability, and a just response. And I kind of started there. I'd like to think through this prompt in two registers. First of all, I wanted to immerse us in a settlement that I've spent a great deal of time with, which represents the crisis condition raised in the prompt through what I think of as a really devastating politics and aesthetics of ephemerality. Second, I wanted to speak to a text and through a text that was written in the years following the establishment of this settlement, which asks us to comprehend academic freedom. I believe this text suggests a way to work restitutively and to imagine a just response, in the words of the organizers, through academic freedom. So to think about this, I'll attempt to immerse us in a very important environment. So let's see if I can, oops, sorry, wrong one. So one of the places where I've worked is in the massive complex of settlements at Dadaab in northern Kenya. For much of its existence, the largest ever refugee hosting site administered by the Unhcr, which is the designated international agency responsible for the protection of refugees. And we heard about them in Ashley's talk. The Unhcr has a mandate to offer protection to people fleeing across a border due to political persecution. Many of its hosting sites are in Africa, where, by the way, the largest number of refugees in the world are hosted. Refugees in these contexts are also offered protection by the terms set by the OAU, which is the Organization of African Unity. This international body built on the foundation of the Unhcr legal instruments by also making provisions for people fleeing due to a host of other insecurities and instabilities prevalent on the continent in the decolonizing environments of the 1960s. At Dadaab, and all the photos that you're seeing here are from Dadaab, the Unhcr and the Kenyan government established relief operations in a region that can be described as an artifact of a past colonial frontier, as well as post-colonial territorial wars between the Kenyan government and pastoralist people. It thus carries with it a memory of detention and an imaginary of a territorially unstable borderland, heightened by its location in the scrub of these semi-arid plains. It's hyena country, where marabou storks loom against the landscape, and you'll see some of these photos to come. So the first humanitarian settlement established at Dadaab in 1991, called Ifo Camp, began to appear on common maps only with the advent of Google Earth in 2001. As of this writing, it hosts nearly 250,000 registered refugees in 5 settlements, with unregistered migrants bringing the total to nearly 500,000, This is the third largest population grouping in Kenya after Nairobi and Mombasa. The scale of this camp complex resulted from a Kenyan government policy to segregate refugees and curtail their mobility, and people who sought refuge in Dadaab have remained entirely dependent upon aid. The trade in humanitarian food and non-food items has become integral to the local economy, and you're seeing images here from many of the markets. The site has accommodated a diverse international humanitarian labor force, and it's facilitated considerable financial flows through investment in refugee-related operations, reaching $100 million a year, and overall trade volume at about 25 million US dollars. These numbers are from about 10 years ago. But what I think has been notable is that its boundedness and also its accessibility has occasioned its frequent study, both by academics and other kinds of researchers in a range of disciplines, compared to other UNHCR sites. 3 generations of people at this point have been born in the camps. All are subject to legal restrictions on education, work, mobility, and migration. So it was intended as a legal and political point of transit, in name at least, but the camp complex has entrenched itself in various ways, suspending refugees in a prolonged liminal state and creating both a socio-political and a built form, which might persist even if the UNHCR removed itself or the Kenyan government decommissioned the camps, which it currently threatens to do. In May of 2016, the government of Kenya announced the intent to decommission the settlements, and they dismantled the Department of Refugee Affairs at that time. But this closure was stayed by a ruling of Kenya's High Court, even as it transparently produced political leverage within the voting constituencies in Kenya, as well as within the international system of states that were negotiating unprecedented displacements and numbers of refugees attempting at that time particularly to enter Europe. The government of Kenya imposed the same threat just last week. So this is to say that Dadaab, and you can, I hope, sense its materiality in these images here, is made even more complex by its own ephemerality or potential ephemerality. This political ephemerality is also architectural. The paradox of permanent impermanence under which the Dadaab settlements have endured for more than 2 decades and through which the architecture of the settlements must be understood is an architecture of lightweight, additive elements built of found, recycled, and remnant material. It signals transience even as it anchors hard infrastructures in the earth and the sky. Dadaab has in fact produced a heavy infrastructural footprint in contrast to the lighter touch of most UNHCR camps. The central compound, and you saw some of the buildings in a few previous images, where humanitarian organization and international agency staff, this is one of the buildings that we're looking at now. These members reside, and these are the areas from which they distribute food and water, administer medical aid and social service operations. These are areas composed of buildings that are designed for durability, an architecture of masonry rather than textiles. The presence of common technologies and also those specific to humanitarian activity have enabled long-range transportation and wireless communication outside regular mapped networks, which support aid operations in this quote unquote undeveloped region. Its body of artifacts include telecom masts planted in the desert, ground vehicles adapted as mobile antenna, and satellite hardware connecting field offices with headquarters in capitals worldwide. Finally, the prolonged existence of the settlements, regularly framed only in terms of protracted political crisis, results precisely from the continuous yield of the freshwater Merti aquifer, a relic of a Jurassic era rift. a system of bore wells penetrating the sedimentary layers to consume the aquifer have exerted a pumping action that breached its envelope through the saltwater layers that surround it, which introduced salinity into the groundwater through a constellation of points over time. However, even as the hardware of the camp complex and intensity of inhabitation above compromised the aquifer, they never put it at risk of depletion. In spite of these permanent structures from the surface of the land to points beyond the Earth's atmospheric borders, the prolonged humanitarian intervention has instantiated a persisting and changing body of architectural ephemera, including mobile dwellings and repurposed materials and goods that have imprinted into the landscape the economic and technological flows of the international agencies and the local traders. These configure empirical signs of impermanence, which belie the concrete infrastructure engaged with the surrounding ecosystem. This is all to say, the architecture of Dadaab has been figured as much by the visual frailty of dwellings, dusted red by the wind and clad in recovered textile and sheet metal fragments, as by a spectacular array of satellites and their dishes, aeronautic fleets sitting on tarmac, all-terrain vehicular convoys, aluminum and PVC water storage towers, hydraulic extraction machinery, and the large settlements themselves. Ironically, this materiality and aesthetics is cloaked in an architecture that appears as little more than shanties and huts in the bush. To speak of Dadaab is to speak of several paradoxes. It performs ephemerality in many registers. Due to its political and social complexity, scale, and yet prolonged impermanence, it approaches yet resists common characterizations of the urban. It has an equally ambivalent relationship to the tenuous architectures that signify a camp. Its incipient urbanity grows unexpectedly out of emergency and unsettlement. The shocking ephemerality of this massive complex of settlements is regularly framed in the most pejorative of terms, which undermine the lives of people, mostly women and unaccompanied minors, who have run for their lives. In the words of the poet Warsan Shire, when home is the mouth of a shark. What is almost never narrated is that the instability and crisis behind this running, if not from 1991, then at least from 1992, stems almost purely from climate-based insecurity around essentials, food, water, shelter. If the industrialized and globalized so-called North has imposed this insecurity so that states have so concretely failed these refugees, whether Somalia, Kenya, or those states comprising the international regime, how indeed are they to be materially and psychically repaired? How can we think on profound ephemerality in restitutive terms? For this, I want to end by turning to the text for a talk, Identity, Authority, and Freedom, the Potentate and the Traveler, given by Edward Said in Cape Town in the time just preceding Nelson Mandela's election in 1994 and just after the establishment of the Dadaab refugee camps. Perhaps this moment was pregnant with thought on restitution. And I'm grateful to my friend and colleague Noura Akawi for sending me this text during an anti-racism workshop at Cooper Union, in which architecture students attempted to dismantle the thesis review process, and perhaps we can refer to it here for our restitution work. Said takes the reader on a contradictory path through and to academic freedom. He first thinks through the university's apartness, its remit to self-isolate in order to avoid collusion with political forces, as well as its reactionary counterproposal to not only admit worldly concerns, but particularly to seek relevance. He contrasts these North American vicissitudes with those of the Arab world, in which the calls to decolonize and Arabize the curriculum, as he noted, fell to nationalistic forms of not freedom, but fear, not the advancement of knowledge, but self-preservation. He recognizes that every society has an other, and that the academic precinct is ultimately intellectual. Academic freedom, he says, is the freedom to be critical. Of the irony of being a Palestinian invited as an American to speak to South Africans at a South African university, he writes that well over 2/3 of the population in occupied Palestine is made up of people under the age of 18. The sheer massive brutality of denying them school and college or university by systematic edict is extraordinary. I could say the same of Dadaab. As such contradictions are levied in the name of academic freedom, not to mention morality, he asks, what kind of identity do we then allow to lead us, to guide our study, to dictate our educational processes? His essay concludes on 2 images for inhabiting the academic and cultural space provided by school and university. The first image is of the king and potentate, for whom academic freedom rests upon authority and power, mastery and detachment. The second is that of the traveler, who need not defend the frontiers of the university, but who crosses over, traverses territory, and abandons fixed positions all the time. So which do you think he chooses? And which might we choose as we think with climate refugees and migrants? To make reparations, we might first imagine with climate refugees, what might this restored world bring? What first book would be read? What first song would be heard? What would a restituted terrain be? I believe with Said, it would be the domain of the traveler, one who may migrate with the greatest intellectual freedom, free of the need for self-protection and self-adulation, free of dogma, open to play and to joy. To do this with dedication and love, as well as a realistic sense of the terrain, Said writes, is, I believe, a kind of academic freedom at its highest. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Anu, for also this moving talk and your photographs, which are actually so rare to see, and also for bringing us face to face with our own situatedness in the academy. And I believe Bronwyn's presentation is ready now, so we may go ahead and have that.
Thank you, everybody. And thank you so much. I really actually appreciated having a chance to hear that beautiful presentation before I went forward. Am I able to control this myself, or?
No. You will have to say next.
Yeah. Okay, great. Okay, so I'll just so in commenting on these themes, as I said before, I wanted to start with a series of images that went viral several years ago. And these images, and maybe you could go to the first picture, it's not very complicated slides, but just a few pictures. And some of you may recognize these images that appeared, they were pictures of art installations that began appearing around European cities in 2011, 2014. They depicted tiny, very little miniature white men who were made of cement, dressed in bland business attire. And they were in serious trouble. They were about to be overtaken by rising waters, or they were in this picture, as you see, kind of glumly going down into their fate under the water. Some were stranded on ledges. Some were drowning in puddles. Some were curled up in grocery carts, floating out to sea. But they didn't really seem to care about what was happening to them. They looked like they were still busy with their workday routine, hunched over briefcases, still staring at their phones as if they were more concerned about missing a message than anything else that might be happening around them. These figures were part of an installation art project that was done by Isaac Cardall, and this one was entitled Follow the Leaders. But in 2014, when the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change met in Berlin, a photo featuring one of his installations went viral when someone circulated it with a new caption. And could you please go to the next slide? Thank you. And the caption read, "Politicians arguing about global warming." I don't think it's been documented who circulated that caption, but that was probably about the time that I first saw it and shared it with my students. And as you can see, it features a group of men who are almost completely submerged in a puddle. And some can hold their faces above water and continue to carry on with what looks like kind of a mundane business meeting, seemingly unperturbed by the fact that their shorter colleagues are already underwater. So when I'm asked to reflect on the theme of climate refugees and international law, this photo always kind of comes to my mind. For the purposes of today's discussion, I want to suggest that we, reflect on the significance of these images and maybe tweak the caption to read, "Arguing about climate refugees," and think about its implications for us as we talk about these themes. And I'm not accusing any of you of being little bald cement men, but just to think about what we're witnessing in these debates. And more specifically, I want to use these images as a starting point for reflecting on what I take to be 3 major limitations of established human rights frameworks and how they've become associated with contradictory responses to the harms and injustices of displacement associated with climate change. And then I want to conclude by thinking about some of the strategies that have been pioneered by environmental justice scholars and activists and how they might be useful in contributing to this broader conversation about restitution and reparation. So first, the first limitation I want to address that I think is kind of captured in these images is this sense in which human rights legal frameworks were championed or have been championed as a basis for empowering people to pursue transformative responses to the limits of established legal frameworks for addressing systemic forms of abuse and institutionalized injustice. But influential human rights organizations and institutions have favored extremely minimalist mandates that prioritize protections associated with, quote, physical integrity rights, such as torture, genocide, and persecution. And this has been championed specifically as a strategy for galvanizing support for international legal norms by focusing on abuses that are said to be kind of viscerally shocking and like spur people to action in response to claims made by victims and galvanize support for those who are who are seeking protection and assistance. And they're said to be, by focusing on this minimalist set of abuses that overlap with kind of corollary abuses in the laws of war carved out in the Geneva Conventions, there's this claim that this will help to kind of galvanize support for the consolidation of like a basic framework that could be enforceable in international law. And so when we think about debates on human rights responses to climate refugees, it's common for these debates to begin with a discussion of the limitations of the Refugee Convention as a convention that defines a refugee as a person who crosses a border due to a, quote, well-founded fear of persecution. In my own city, where I live and teach and am raising my kids, many people are familiar with the limits of this definition, that it does not extend refugee status or protections to internally displaced, and it does not apply to, quote, economic migrants who are forced to leave their homes to escape untenable forms of poverty, exploitation associated with legacies of interventions or forms of violence that don't qualify as persecution, but nevertheless threaten people's lives in very real ways. And we have many such migrants living in our community. In 1985, Assam El Hinawi of the United Nations Environmental Program, UNEP, proposed that it would be important to provide assistance for environmental refugees, and that this would be an appropriate classification for those forced to flee due to market environmental disruptions that render homes temporarily or permanently unsuitable to supporting human life. In response, many, including the UN High Commissioner for Refugees at the time, raised concern that this terminology would weaken support for established legal protections granted to refugees under the convention. In 1992, the International Organization for Migration warned that the number of people displaced by climate change was likely to rise dramatically, and noted that the lack of consensus on terminology was an obstacle or contributing to stalling in efforts to move forward on a response. And more recently, however, fast forwarding a long time, the Human Rights Committee, which monitors compliance with the International Covenant on Civil Political Rights, issued a landmark ruling in response to a complaint filed by Untitled, not sure if I'm pronouncing that right, but who was deported back to his home country of Kiribati after seeking asylum in New Zealand in 2015. He had argued that he and his family had already been threatened by violent land disputes associated with climate change. And in assessing the complaint, the Human Rights Committee held that state parties would be obligated to grant asylum to those whose lands had been rendered uninhabitable due to climate change, and that they would not have to prove that these changes represented an imminent threat to their survival, but they still rejected the claim on the grounds that he would have, the family would have like roughly 15 years to make preparations to leave. So from this perspective, it's still too soon to take action to address the plight of those on islands like Kiribati who are threatened by rising seas. In a dissenting opinion, Duncan Laki Muza suggested that it might be more accurate to say that the committee's response was too little and too late. As he put it, the action taken by New Zealand is like, quote, forcing a drowning person back into a sinking vessel with the justification that, after all, there are other passengers on board. So I think that coming back to this image, I think that Cordal's installations push us to investigate, to kind of step outside of this back and forth on how to, on the terminology, and to investigate this conversation from a somewhat different angle, from the perspective of a somewhat different time, or stepping out of time, because this is a conversation, and to think about this as a conversation that's in some sense pushing the problem out of time, that it's too soon, but it's also too late to address the plight of people displaced by climate change. Why are we in a situation where we're arguing about terminology as the waters are rising? Human rights minimalism has been championed as a basis for securing support for urgent interventions to protect the most vulnerable, and that has been an important lifesaver for many people. It's also been associated with a pattern of deferring justice claims on the ground that it's too soon to depart from established practices and norms, which has resulted in a situation where people are often reluctant to pursue meaningful responses to those who sound the alarm until it's too late to prevent catastrophic harm and crises that threaten everyone. So coming back to this to this image and looking at it from another way. I was really struck by Anne's discussion of haunting, and I've often thought that these images were kind of like ghosts of the future or ghosts of the present or something ghostly about them. And that one of the reasons that they're so haunting is that the way they represent the kind of denial in a way that I think is rather, that is very, in some sense, familiar, but also not always discussed. Human rights legal frameworks have been championed as a basis for confronting denial. But, and this I see as another interesting contradiction in these frameworks, this goal has been in tension with another feature of human rights and transitional justice frameworks, which has, and particularly transitional justice frameworks that have advanced this goal by investigating systemic injustices and abuses, systemic patterns of abuses and truth commissions, reparation, restorative justice programs, that these transitional justice frameworks has very commonly identified healing and repair with a kind of idea about a break from the past, and a formulation that suggests that the primary obstacle to repair and healing comes from bad memories. And, you know, in the sense of an interior trauma and fragmentary reminders of painful experiences from the past that people cannot seem to shake from their heads. This way of thinking, I think, identifies healing and repair, you know, very familiarly, you know, to, I think, many of us with the idea of an achievement of closure, and that closure is often represented as a kind of freedom or escape from the toxic effects of bad memories, and suggesting that those who are most vulnerable to abuse, who carry such bad memories, may not be ready to join this group of men who are clearly freed from a kind of awareness of the past. They seem to be just immersed in kind of following along as they are taught to do, insulated from a sense of, you know, an affective connection to their responsibilities from the past. And this idea of like a freedom from toxic memories, I think, suggests that those who are, you know, that reinforces a sense of the sort of logics by which people who are most vulnerable, people who are, you know, as discussed just in the previous presentation, people who are in camps, that they are to be helped, but they are not to be included in decision making. And that those who are in positions of privilege, that they will make better judgments, they will make better decisions if they remain insulated from too much exposure to the sort of realities of these harms. This framework does not offer a meaningful response to a different kind of bad memory in the sense of cultural amnesia or collective, you know, failures of memory regarding responsibilities for the burdens and risks associated with climate change. It doesn't frame assistance as a debt. It's very much in tension, I think, with the discussion that Ashley was referring to in the Cochabamba Declaration and the move to sort of identify climate debt and adaptation debt. And it's not even that consistent with efforts to identify assistance as an obligation or a right associated with a kind of shared collective commitment to community. It identifies justice and freedom with the freedom to escape, in a sense, escape toxic harm and insulate oneself from demands of those who remain trapped, quote unquote, prisoners of the past or trapped in the past. And so I think I'm just gonna kind of, you know, think about like sort of an obvious symbolic kind of more recent example of this way of thinking. I think this, in my mind, I think of, and I have another image somewhere in this, it might not be the next, if you wanted to just go keep going, because I already did that. Okay, that's a fun one. That one is the one I'm looking for. I think that this is kind of a stark representation of this idea that, you know, that what we see, the two of the very most powerful men in the world, the richest men in the world, kind of openly broadcasting that they don't believe that there's anything that they can do about these problems and about the planet, you know, about harm to the planet, while they're contributing to it, of course. But even aside from that, they're suggesting that they're going to be refugees and take, you know, a very small number of people to Mars, despite, you know, the fact that that just doesn't seem like a very appealing home. This is, I think, an interesting kind of view of where that takes people. Okay, one more minute. I'm going a little too slow. Thank you for the reminder. A third contradiction associated with human rights, and I'll just wrap up quickly, has to do with its role as a basis for pursuing accountability and justice in response to powerful actors implicated in abuse and exploitation. The human rights framework ostensibly addresses the limits of humanitarian charity and the laws of war by offering protections that are meant to empower people to confront abusive authorities, to hold them accountable, and to confront unjust hierarchies. And they pursued storytelling strategies that identify worthy victims as those who are most helpless, lacking in agency, and shame those who deviate from established norms. These stories appeal to the sensibilities of powerful and privileged audiences that are insulated from harm, suggesting that those in positions of power can play a useful role in struggles for justice by using their privilege to provide these modest forms of assistance. And as Esra noted in the outset, human rights activists have influenced efforts to prohibit ecocide as a crime of war, and now there's move to build that into the ICC. However, ecocide is still framed as an intentional criminal wrong, and does not cover, and even if it is adopted, would be very limited as a basis for repair as a criminal framing. So I just want to just briefly offer three suggestions. I mean, maybe I should just stop actually, because I'm out of time. But I can come back to the environmental justice comments in the Q&A if people are interested.
Oh, do you want to list those three like in 1 minute, or do you want to wait?
I'm happy to do that. I just realized that my minute was definitely up, so I just thought I'd
just
rather
maybe 1 more minute, so that
absolutely.
The conclusion is there.
Yeah, so I in thinking about and in thinking about the, you know, how we address these contradictions, I think that a useful source of guidance comes from environmental justice critique of professional environmental organizations. And beginning in the early 1990s, three major dimensions of that critique, I think, have important implications for how we address the limitations of these frameworks. One is the critique of the idea of nature as victim, and this kind of pure nature that people can escape to in kind of a pristine space, which I think has, you know, is an interestingly kind of parallel images that are produced by Sierra Club that are similar to what Cornell has produced of like older men in kind of alone in nature, except that being like an escape. Environmental justice activists argued, you know, that this was a nihilistic and representation of nature that prevented responses to injustices associated with displacement and colonial legacies that had gone into creating these pristine spaces. And the second, you know, and I think that has important implications for how we think about victimhood in human rights. The second point I was going to make is that environmental justice activists have proposed an idea of repair that actively challenges escapism by demanding shared responsibility for the harms, burdens, the disproportionate harms, burdens, and risks associated with environmental hazards. And I think that vision of repair is vital in order to avoid failures of accountability that occur when the people who are most harmed by hazards and abuses associated with environmental hazards are excluded from political decision making. And the third point that environmental justice, and I think probably the most fundamental and important, that environmental justice activists have demanded, I think rather successfully, even in local settings, is inclusion of frontline communities at all levels of decision making, meaningful inclusion. And I think that this is something that human rights advocates have been somewhat slow to really think about what this would mean for them in addressing the plight of refugees and others affected by abuse. And I'll stop there.
Thank you so much. And thank you for bringing the limitations and maybe the absence of international law frameworks to respond responsibly, but also ending in 3 suggestions. We're running a little late, so I'll immediately go and introduce our final speaker, Billy Fleming, who is the Wilkes Family Director of the Unhcr Center in the Weizmann School of Design, as well as a Senior Fellow with the Data for Progress, and also the co-director of the Climate and Community Project. His fellowship with Data for Progress has focused on the built environment's impacts on climate change and resulted most prominently in the publication of low-carbon public housing policy beliefs tied to the Green New Deal for Public Housing Act that was introduced in 2019. Billy is co-editor of the forthcoming book, An Adaptation Blueprint, and he's also the co-editor and the co-curator of the book, and also the now internationally traveling exhibit Design with Nature Now. Billy is also the lead author of the 2100 project and Atlas for the Green New Deal. He's also the co-author of the Invisible Guide. Billy?
Thank you so much, Esra. Thanks for having me, and just, feel so fortunate to be a part of this conversation. I'm going to go as quick as I can, so I'm going to do my best auctioneer impersonation so we can get to our discussion portion. You're looking here at really quickly at an image of Angola Farm, otherwise known as the Louisiana State Penitentiary. I have a little bit more to say about that. This is a drawing from some students in just a moment, but I really just want to do a couple of things today before we kind of get to our discussion. I want to introduce a couple of conceptual frameworks that have really guided my work, the center's work here at Penn for the last few years, and then go through just a couple of the ways we've been probing some of the questions those frameworks raise about where and how design fits within some of these larger questions about climate reparations, climate justice, and something like a Green New Deal. And I'll begin just with a couple of quick clarifications. So, the title of this was, is spliced together from a larger keynote I just gave a couple of weeks ago and a couple of forthcoming articles. But I'll just kind of begin with, what do I mean by crisis design in the time of crisis? So I think it's important to begin, you, Esra, I think framed this up really well for us at the beginning of the event, but, just to pull from Cedric Robinson, Black Marxism, and many others in this space, thinking about the concept of sacrifice zones and their temporal and geographic delimitations. So thinking about the ways in which capitalism works across the world, within, between, and across cities and nations, that it requires sacrifice zones, that those sacrifice zones are produced in space and time through an existing and imagined racial hierarchy, and that this kind of conceptual framework can help us make sense of the ways in which risk and climate crisis are distributed and unevenly expressed across the landscape. And to also just really quickly to sort of add to that piece of the framework from Naomi Klein, many things I could pull from Naomi's work. Like, no two people have been more vindicated in their work over the last 15 or 20 years than Cedric Robinson and Naomi Klein. But Naomi in this book is writing that running an economy on energy sources that release poisons as an unavoidable part of their extraction and refining has always required sacrifice zones. Whole subsets of humanity categorized as less than fully human, which made their poisoning in the name of progress somehow acceptable, that our political and economic systems and our planetary systems are now at the core. And so thinking about that as a way in which crisis is produced in time and space. And we're looking here at the first real kind of visualization of Matthew Hauer's work. Matt's a climate geographer based at Florida State, the first person to go through and really count up the number of structures, and within those structures, the number of people who will be forcibly displaced because their homes will be underwater under the different sea level rise curve scenarios. So this is by far the most conservative estimate you could get. Obviously, many more people here in the US and obviously abroad already being displaced will be displaced. But here, so when I conceptualize crisis, this is one way to think about those zones. What I mean is that the overlapping crises of COVID-19, for which we certainly know by now, death rates among non-white populations, Black and Indigenous populations in particular, range from 2 to 3.5 times as high as they are for white people in the United States. That climate change, the effects of which are felt most acutely in the global South and in low-income, low-lying communities of color, and what are often referred to as the bottom in the US. And racialized and police state violence, all overlapping in time and space as features, not bugs of the system. This is not news to this audience. These are the kinds of statements that you can throw out at design lectures, though. So the foregrounding of these crises in popular media and in the popular imagination are really part and parcel to why calls for a Green New Deal, a Red Deal, and now a Red, Black, and Green New Deal have emerged, and in some cases merged some of their operations around a shared program of housing justice, racial and economic justice, and climate justice. And they're appearing in this form for many reasons, of which I'm sure we can talk about, in our discussion after my slides are through. But in part, I think because of this moment again that Naomi is opening up for us in the foreword to the really lovely book, A Planet to Win: Why We Need a Green New Deal, in which she's writing, the interplay between lofty dreams and earthly victories has always been at the heart of movements of deep progressive transformation. In the US, the breakthroughs won for workers and their families after the Civil War, during the Great Depression, as well as civil rights and the environment in the 60s and 70s, were not just responses to crises demanded from below, they were also the products of dreams of very different kinds of societies. Dreams invariably dismissed as impossible and impractical at the same time. And what set those moments apart was not the presence of crises, of which capitalism provides no shortage, but that they were times of rupture when utopian imagination was unleashed. And I say that, that I think there's a very easy way to get excited about the Green New Deal or something like it at a global scale in uncritical ways. I know this group is not guilty of that, but many are. And I think lots of important questions have been raised around the Green New Deal and its global consequences. This one from Jasper Barnes, I think there's a couple here I'll run through really quickly, is especially important. Jasper is writing here about the possibility of green imperialism and green capitalism, or the likelihood of green imperialism and green capitalism simply being reproduced and laundered through a framework like the Green New Deal. Theoria Francos in her piece in Viewpoint magazine, Plan, Mood, Battlefield, is also I think pointing towards some of these possibilities. Writing there's a charge that the Green New Deal, like the old New Deal, amounts to the state qua-executive committee of the bourgeoisie, rescuing capitalism from the planetary crisis it has created, and this rendering rather than empowering frontline and vulnerable communities, as the resolution, Nature 109, claims. The policy framework risks or will amount to a corporate welfare windfall of investment opportunities, lubricated with tax breaks and subsidies and public-private partnerships and infrastructure outlays that will stimulate real estate development. And as these analyses point out, the kind of win-win, lose-lose scenario for win-win being on the private side, lose-lose on the public, itself is based on a kind of false understanding of contemporary capitalism, looking at the Bakken Formation in North Dakota right there, and that's methane gas flaring and some really quick gas-led fracking development. But the declining profit rates, speculative bubbles, financialization, rentier-like behavior, and accumulation by upward redistribution, this sort of vampire-like quality of capital has never been more apparent than through these kinds of systems. And the notion that capital might, with very little inducement, suddenly overcome these tendencies and invest in productive activities is in itself its own nostalgic fantasy. Now, other people, certainly this collection of folks here today and other folks like my friend Femi Taiwo at Georgetown have thought and written about this as well, thinking about the possibilities that a Green New Deal might open up for a conversation around reparations and climate justice in this larger global north to south relation. And I won't go through Femi's piece. I just wanted to highlight it here because it's at least for me been quite important in some of my thinking. And so I think if we can hold that conceptual framework together, the idea of sacrifice zones, being bounded in time and space, and being concentrated where they are through existing racial hierarchies, then I think a second one that's important to really understand where design fits in these larger conversations is the political economic framework, the one that bounds the design professions. And so, while design has always kind of found itself tethered to and bounded by various forms of global capitalism and racial capitalism, each political economic era that has bounded our work has been contingent and historically situated. It would take me much more than 15 minutes to kind of roll through, but it's important to begin from a simple sort of premise. And it's that the design professions are simply not capable of reconciling their ethical and material contradictions, those of urban greening and ecological gentrification, those of high carbon luxury real estate development and the LEED and site certification programs, and those of state-led investments in urbanism in the public realm with state-sanctioned violence and racial hierarchy. In contra to the sort of self-mythology and exceptionalist rhetoric that defines much of my field's scholarship, the professions themselves are indistinguishable in their aims, operations, and outcomes from the rest of the professional services industry. And thinking of them in that way, for me, in my work, is helpful in sort of thinking through where we go next. So put another way, the design professions are best understood as materially and conceptually aligned with the multinational consulting firms like McKinsey and Company. And while their instruments differ, McKinsey is often more focused on organizational structure and financial optimization or on regime control. Design firms are focused on the built and natural environment. They're all pursuing similar commissions and contracts from the same pools of public and private capital in many of the same cities and nations, and are often complicit in many of the most egregious forms of human immiseration that capitalism has to offer. And we're looking here at a proudly displayed project on AECOM's website of their Pima County, Arizona prison facility. We're looking here at HOK's global Abu Dhabi National Oil headquarters, also proudly displayed on their site. And looking here at Martha Short's partners' eco-apartheid project in the UAE, in which they've somehow decided to put Rachel McAdams here in a little purple bubble, sipping what I'm sure is a $300 glass of wine, built with literal enslaved labor, in its delivery. And you look, I'm sure we'll start to play. This is headquarters and projects for the largest architecture engineering firms in the world. It's not light pollution on the bottom there, that's subnational GDP. So you can watch that play for a second. Design is not yet reckoned with its role in this global economic system and laundering capital and authoritarian power around the world. Doug Spencer gestures in this direction in one of his recent books that while architects and architectural theorists have generally been less brazen than folks like Patrick Schumacher about their enthusiasms for the subsumption of the urban and architectural orders to those of the market, they have tended since at least the mid-1990s to push those same trusts of the way of the world that has observed the logics of neoliberalism. And we're looking here at this bizarre book from Tom Couch on You Are What You Drive, where he caricatures people based on the kind of car they drive. Without the burden of considering what might be ethical or desirable in the design professions, we've been free to luxuriate in the opportunities that global capitalism provides to our professional services industry. Gabriel Bonat has written about this in this sort of larger sweep of professionalization in the West and the US in particular, writing that the professions emerged in their modern forms, establishing uniform standards of practice and conduct. The new professionals were, in general, politically progressive, seeing their purpose as the renovation of American democracy, the modernization of conditions of work and life. And early on, at least, they tended to imagine themselves as the antagonists of capitalists and outworkers, or at least the brokers between the two. Yet, the raison d'etre of the PMC, the professional managerial class, was the reproduction of capitalist society writ large. And in that, I think, sums up really the ways in which architecture and landscape architecture, city planning have continued to operate in the global north and especially in the US. These kinds of sentiments of sort of design exceptionalism are inescapable in this field, particularly at elite schools of design, where every review, every recruiting spiel, all manner of work product are shaped by this field's kind of epistemic hegemony, all of which tends to parrot these axioms. And have become associated with lots of things in our field, like landscape urbanism. You're looking here at a rendering from Big and Oceanic's UN project, this floating city, which got a ton of attention, still is getting a ton of attention. The literal plan for this, what you're looking at here, are that these are wealthy global elites visiting the resort here, enjoying the boardwalk, these are climate refugees working the fields. That's the plan for how to make this particular community work. I think maybe they've started to back off of that proposal, but its introduction, that was foregrounded. And when I'm thinking about this in a US context, although this is kind of reproduction that happens around the world, looking here at prisons built atop abandoned mine lands in Appalachia. This is a part of the country where the literal federal policy towards the region for 50 years now has been to depopulate through divestment, so starving people of resources, creates all kinds of economic precarity that lends itself to a rural economic development program that is based on building detention facilities atop abandoned mine lands. It's done in the things that make that possible are sort of threefold. One is that there are literal grant programs specifically to build prisons atop abandoned mine lands in Appalachia, federal and state. The second is that these sites are obviously all flattened and cleared. They're strip mines, so they're easy to build things on. And the third is that you don't have to remediate them to the same degree to put incarcerated people on them that you would to do just about anything else. And so, Ezra mentioned this kind of first line to an essay that I wrote a few years ago now as kind of a provocation to introduce the work. And, I don't know when, so I'll just repeat it here. So I don't know when the myth of designers as climate saviors, agents of change, whatever it might be, began, but I know it's time to kill it. We might do that by focusing in on the ways in which the political economy of the built environment really bounds a design practice. And we can think about it, although I won't go into a ton of detail here, as a way of pushing back against the kind of post-critical moment of theory in architecture and landscape architecture, in which some of our now most prominent people, who we can talk about in the discussion if we want to, have written things like the setting out a post-critical project or program does not necessarily entail a capitulation to market forces, but that might happen. And others writing that a third significant cultural position of landscape urbanism is a real politic of laissez-faire economic development and public-private engagement in the planning process. And in those kinds of, in that kind of rhetoric, we can see the real ideological project here foregrounded. I won't spend a ton more time on it, but I'll say this is what drives designers to dedicate, resources to things like affordable housing and social housing, as they also dedicate resources to geoengineering and eco-modernism instead of eco-socialism. And to really invest themselves in the reproduction, again, of capitalist society writ large, to use one more time. And I think it's the play, and so in that context, the kind of questions that have driven most of the rest of my work in the center the last few years have been, can a set of practices tied to luxury real estate deliver anything meaningful to communities impacted by global warming and inequality? Or put another way, can designers be both instruments of neoliberalism and capitalism and an activist force in the fight for climate justice? But the answer to that, I think, is pretty obviously no. And so I've spent some time now thinking about what we do next with that in a place with considerable resources and power. I mean, Penn has there are many things I could say about the institution, but it has lots of resources and lots of power. And those of us thinking about these things in the context of knowing that designers writ large, although there are phenomenal ones like Unhcr out there, have not yet begun to grapple in any meaningful way with this inward turns, focus on aesthetics, technology, and ecology over larger political economic theory and questions. And nor have our professional organizations really acknowledged, let alone developed alternatives to our wholesale capture by, what Sam Stein and others have referred to as the real estate state. And so beyond the kind of sanctioned practices of these organizations, a few alternatives have begun to emerge. The architecture lobby there on the left, Dark Matter University there in the middle, designers protests there on the right. They remain small and nascent within architecture. Landscape architecture has no real equivalent to these. And so, to think about ways that we could begin building, to build on some of their work, DMU, the architecture lobby, and others, and to think about ways of breathing new life into an institution like the McClintock Center, like Penn, have thought about what are some of the more radical agendas we might put on the table might look like. And so to do so, I've kind of asked, what might an insurgent set of practices that makes our fields more useful and relevant to the various movements for climate, racial, and economic justice actually look like? And there are sort of two rejoinders, I think, to that question. We're looking here at an old reproduction of a clip from the Levelers or the Diggers in Britain, a bunch of anarchists and communists, pushing a sort of agrarian state counter-revolution or revolutionary agenda in the 17th century. So thinking about that, one way to respond to that question is to simply take a more expansive view of what constitutes architecture, landscape architecture, and design. To look beyond the kind of sanctioned practices of credentialed professionals, often concentrated in the global north, and to look for more radical histories and contemporary examples of practice in anarchist communities and indigenous communities and others with anti-capitalist traditions and ideologies. So for instance, for landscape architects to overcome their troubled fascination with figures like Frederick Law Olmsted, whose masterpiece Central Park was predicated upon the eviction of residents of Seneca Village, a thriving at the time Black community in Manhattan, we might look to examples like the Diggers. We might look to others across the world. The other is that through a kind of form of power analysis, we can begin to think critically about the instruments and institutions at our disposal. And for me, this has meant using studios, using the center as spaces to align our work with that of local and national, and in some cases international climate, housing, and racial justice leaders, and to work together developing visions of the future that both make their demands more concrete, and by doing so make them feel more pragmatic, and also expose our students to the very large world outside of the professional school that they spend almost all of their time in. And for us, it's really been built around a theory of change that no one will understand or should be expected to understand something like the Green New Deal, something like the energy transition through molecules in the atmosphere like carbon, or through the source of the electrons in their circuits. We're not going to log onto Zoom next year and know that our computers are powered by wind instead of coal, but we will be able to understand material investments in how and where we live, and deep energy retrofits for our home, and low or no carbon transportation to where we work, and decarbonized and resiliency centers on top within our public schools that kids go to, in the kind of civic infrastructure that binds our lives together. And for us, thinking about the work this way has allowed our center, has allowed our students to be able to think about how to align the academy with the more radical movements in the climate justice world, who frankly have put ideas like the Green New Deal on the table that we've been able to entertain. And so not to think about the Green New Deal as kind of a solution to a problem, but as an invitation to imagine alternative ways of working, of alternative futures, and to literally pull from Congresswoman Ocasio-Cortez in her introductory press conference, in which she asked all of us to think about HR 109, the kind of seminal document in the policy world for the Green New Deal, as an invitation for collaboration and a request for proposals. And in the built environment professions, in the design professions, to think about the things literally enumerated in HR 109 that are part and parcel to the work that we do. Won't go through all of these because I know we're tight on time, but happy to circle back to them. And I'll just say too, I often get asked, why focus on the G&D and why not on something like Project Drawdown or some more technocratic plan? Lots of reasons for that I think are probably clear, we could talk about. But the most obvious is just that it's totally unique in the American experience as a climate plan that even attempts to fuse the more technocratic demands for decarbonization with the aims of blue-collar workers for good, dignified, stable jobs, and the demands of frontline communities for centering justice and at least the investment side, hopefully the entire side of the G&D. And that work, at least for me, for the studios I run here now, I've just finished the second, have a third kind of slot for the fall. That work's focused on 3 regions and 3 industries within them. Appalachia, the lower Mississippi Delta, the Corn Belt of the Midwest. It's in part because I've asked students to think about how to prioritize the first round of investment through something like a Green New Deal, and have asked them to do so by thinking through the places we have to get right technically to win the jobs, justice, and decarbonization goals of a G&D, and also from that smaller set of places to think about who belongs at the front of the line, either because historically they're at the back, if they're in line at all, or because they offer an opportunity to grow your political coalition by making the material benefits of something like a G&D obvious early and upfront. And the 3 systems we focused on have been the commercial system, the fossil fuel system, and the industrial ag system. Again, lots of reasons for that. The most important to know is just that in the aftermath of George Floyd's murder, the Movement for Black Lives and the Green New Deal Network merged some of their organizing operations. So they created a new national table to coordinate strategy and some of the messaging, some of the other things that they do together now. And those 3 industries were identified as among sort of first priorities for that merger. And that work has ranged pretty wildly within the studios. I've asked students to avoid proposing solutions for places they could never know as well as the folks we've worked with there. And I've asked them to experiment with all kinds of methods for thinking about and working in these places. And ultimately, their deliverables have varied wildly. There's a workbook for dreaming, kind of aimed at democratizing the design process, based in large part on Mariam Makaba and Shira Hassan's Fumbling Towards Repair. This is a kind of trauma-informed restorative justice workbook or handbook for how to do that kind of work in your community. Here has gone through a version of that for how to democratize the design process in Appalachia. This came at the request of a number of the groups we worked with in that studio. Won't spend a ton of time on it. That this book kind of lives on the site. I'm happy to drop into the chat after we're done. But was part of a larger kind of almanac that their group put together. Included, a manual for converting decommissioned prisons into rural electric co-ops, and all manner of other things in Appalachia. And there were a series of other kind of zines, oral histories, character developments, and other kinds of projects kind of around the country that they focused on developing there. And in a sense, these studios have become, kind of an extension of that larger critique I sort of mentioned at the beginning of this talk. You're looking here at propaganda posters they developed, here at a couple of zines or comics that were developed in studio. And they focused pretty explicitly on rural communities in the US already operating outside of markets and flows of global capital, the flows of which already bound so much of contemporary design practice, and have tried to push back, I think, on the ways in which capitalist realism frames so much of the kind of work that happens in our professional schools. And is often used to describe projects that are eminently buildable, even if the end result of that construction is disastrous. So put another way, these studios have sought to question whether it's pragmatic to uphold the very systems of exploitation and immiseration that have brought us, climate crisis, eco-apartheid, and all of the other things we've sort of heard about and talked about today. And of course, there's lots more I could say. These drawings are these are public. This is part of a project we're about to finish called a field notes sort of an internationalist guide to the Green New Deal. There's lots more I could say about how we're starting to think about it. This is, looking at sixth extinction, biodiversity loss mapping around the world, one of the consequences of global climate change, obviously. Looking at some of the active and speculative rare earth mineral deposits and mines that'll be at the core of the energy transition. So if the US, if Europe are serious about getting to something like 100% renewable or clean energy, it's going to require the extraction of rare earth minerals from primarily the global south. And thinking about that, anticipating that as a way of thinking through frameworks for restorative justice, for climate reparations, and a north-south sort of relational perspective is going to be hugely important. And so the last thing I'll say here too, and actually I won't say it, I'm going to play something for you, and I think my sound is going to work, is that, my students always surprise me. So when I ask them to engage in this kind of cli-fi storytelling work, they get very little instruction from me, and they're often free to kind of go where they want. We were lucky to have a student, Emily Jacoby, who had worked, in radio before coming to grad school, and produced, a podcast series set in the future in the Midwest. And I'll just kind of let the intro, the 1 minute or so thing, speak for itself, and then I will stop sharing.
As I say every week, we're powered by the wind and powered by the people. I'm your host, Carrie Moss, and welcome to Breath of Air. This is Iowa People's Radio, for the people, by the people, and of the people. In this week's episode, we're continuing our series Voicing the Green New Deal, honoring 50 years of MARA, the Midwest Agricultural Regional Agency that worked to make the heartland flower through green jobs, education, and collective care. This series examines how artists have given voice, power, and representation to half a century of transformation in the lives of Midwesterners. Each interview threads public history into private stories, and it's in these intimate spaces of home we can understand the ways our world changed for the better. This week, before we speak to famed DJs of Detroit and Muscatine, we're going to trace back the systems that had to end to bring us into our shared future of plentitude.
So with that, I will stop and look forward to our combo. Thanks, Ezra.
Thank you so much, Billy, for this very fast and very rich presentation. So may I ask everyone to turn on their video so that we can have a conversation and the audience can see us? And thank you again for these very rich presentations. And I think, yeah, we are coming from very different disciplines, but I hope that there will be an opportunity to talk to each other despite the different disciplines that are informing our works. As you were speaking, I thought of maybe two trajectories of further discussion that might bring us into conversation. One was about ways of finding, for the lack of a better word, a feedback loop between people on the ground who are refugees, who are vulnerable, that Anu talked about, and in part of her photographs showed about. So people on the ground on the one hand, and the international as well as professional organizations. I mean, despite all the limitations that Bronwyn talked about, international law and transitional justice, we nevertheless do need those declarations like climate debt that actually that brought a concept like climate debt that Ashley was talking about, or the Green New Deal, or maybe the professionals who are using their own expertise to deal with these problems. But I guess the lack of a feedback loop or a lack of a connection between the two is usually a problem. So I kind of thought that is one line of thinking that might bring these conversations together. And another question in my mind was, how do we really differentiate from radical policy change that obviously is needed, but how do we differentiate that from like the more academic utopian thinking, whose problems that we have seen so many times? I mean, in a way, Ashley, you talked about how some architects are embracing this utopian thinking, but after so much architectural determinism and fascism, in a way, has been enacted through that top-down utopian thinking, like I know best and that sort of thing. In the architecture discipline, we are almost allergic to that sort of thinking as well. So what is the difference? How do we differentiate between radical policy change that is needed from the utopian thinking that sometimes very easily sweeps in as if it's that radical policy change? So how do we not confuse the two with each other? So these were the two basic lines of discussion that I had in mind, but maybe I can start by asking everyone to either respond to each other or to these questions. Ashley, I see you unmuted yourself. So
yeah, Esra, I mean, thank you for giving us such generative prompts at the outset, and then for these really interesting questions. For me, the kind of background is that eco-fascism is a rising force, and there has to be a great deal of mobilization against that. And the current conjuncture, I think, has raised some possibilities for that, because we've seen how the globe-straddling economies of capitalism are very unsustainable and incredibly unjust. So the last year has really hammered those issues home. As Billy talked about in his presentation, the Green New Deal, which we've just gotten the first salvo in the United States of that from the Biden administration a couple of days ago, is opening some possibilities, but there are all kinds of dangers. So I just think it's a real time when a great deal of mobilization has to happen on the ground by social movements, and there has to be a huge amount of solidarity across boundaries. And so I think it's to frontline communities who are engaged in this work that we should look and, look for ways to support them. So, connections between indigenous communities who are fighting against pipelines and fossil capitalism, and the movement supporting immigrants, for instance, in the United States, and the awareness that both of those groups have been really incredibly negatively affected historically by border imperialism. That a great deal of the climate refugees are actually indigenous people who've been displaced by both empire and by carbon colonialism and the colonization of the atmosphere. So to sort of see those connections, and as much as we can as academics, to help to lift up those voices, as you're doing by organizing this panel, and to help support the analysis of radical organizations. In the current work I'm doing right now, I've really been inspired by the work of La Via Campesina as a global federation of peasant movements fighting for agroecology. And I think it's through those kinds of organizations that there's going to be some alternative to a world order based on exterminism and extractivism. So I'll stop there. There's so much more to say in response to your questions. I wanted to sort of throw something out to get the conversation going, though.
Anyone else? Yes, Anne?
Yeah, just I think actually we're talking from the location of the academy, but we're speaking globally, especially in this the moment of Zoom. But one of the things I've come to feel increasingly is that we have extraordinary amount of power as teachers in the academy. And in talking to my students, I think one of the most radical things we could do, and radical in the sense of going to the roots, is to give our students a sense that they are empowered and that they can empower themselves. Because I think what they're living with is a legacy, deliberate, constructed, what I call the administration of forgetting, a sense that they do not have power, that these issues are too big, that confronting climate change is too huge. And I showed a very unglamorous film called Tomorrow, which starts with the notion that we are very good at creating apocalyptic images and narratives, but we're very bad at creating narratives of what is sustainable, what is possible. And the film is shaped around something as simple as gardening. And we have had stolen from us the knowledge that we are actually able to grow our own food. And the merchants of doubt, I think, have deliberately disempowered us from the degrees to which we can actually have a change. And so that reaching out to our students through film, through forms of strategies, to give them a sense that they can, that where they begin, it doesn't really matter the large scale, but where they begin with what they love, whether it's gardening, whatever it is, that to give them back a sense of, as Ashley has been talking about, some kind of collective activism.
Thank you. Anyone who wants to respond to that?
Yeah, I'll jump in. I'll just say, in addition to agreeing with all of those comments, I think there's kind of those of you in the architecture world know this well, there's kind of like a preposterous theory of change in architecture that no one outside of our field would ever entertain because it's so preposterous. And it's that buildings have like real agency, the ability to, that like formal and aesthetic gestures can, some folks in our field have literally said can short circuit capitalism or otherwise transform the ways in which we relate to each other. And I think that, that kind of analysis points to a view of architecture that's just incredibly self-important and wildly unrealistic in the ways that like the Green New Deal is often framed as unrealistic by those people. This view of the way in which like the world is produced is often so just wildly, I think, unrealistic and empirically like untrue. The built environment is produced by forces far larger than architecture. And again, I think of us as a professional service that simply goes where capital flows. I think for that to change, there are some obvious kind of reformist ideas that are out there. One is, I think with some critical view of what the New Deal state was actually like, a return to federal or national employment for folks in the built environment professions. The New Deal state was heavily populated by landscape architects and architects because their industry was collapsing in the wake of the Great Depression. The federal government in the US has been staffed at 1987 levels since at least 2011, so we don't even have enough people to carry out the day-to-day jobs of those agencies as they exist. That's one kind of obvious reformist way that this has been bandied about. The other, I think, is to sort of think about changes to procurement law that keep the firms like AECOM and HOK, who are literally building the carceral state, from also building all of our public works and infrastructure. I think the more, to Anne's point, the more I think exciting trajectory in the academy is viewing, I think rightfully viewing ourselves as having the luxury of operating outside of market forces if we want to. Not all of our colleagues do that, but we don't have to make the kind of uncomfortable alliances with particular clients that you have to make in a project design firm to keep lights on, to keep whatever prestige machine running that you need to have a firm exist. And I've thought about the kind of images we produce in studios here to do a version, I think, of what Anne is describing, which is to not just simply visualize the demands of the climate justice and abolitionist movements we work with, although we do some of that, but in some ways to try to make them more concrete and useful in partnership with them, to land them, develop form and aesthetics around them, and to give what we're often asked to do is to give them things to organize around. And that's, in some ways what the studios here have been trying to do.
And if I can just add 2 points to follow up on Billy. Mobilized to divest from fossil fuels in our universities, that is within our power, and to divest from militarization, which I still think is the great ghost. It's been ghosted. It's one of the most visible topics to talk about it, educate our students, not forget that the military knows. They're at the forefront. They know exactly what's going on. And Admiral Joseph Lopez said, climate change will provide the conditions which will extend the forever war. So we can use the extraordinary privilege of our being in a university in order to bring back notions of boycott, take our bodies back, take our money back, divest from fossil fuels, divest from the military, and divest from the carceral system.
Yeah, I mean, one of the questions in the Q&A box is trying to maybe make us think of the powers, just like capitalism is a power that's very hard to short circuit. Or Brown, when you were talking about how international law actually is acting like almost a power that is not necessarily in the interest of those that it's supposed to protect. So I mean, as much as empowered we might feel at the academy and so on, I think one of the questions of our audience is trying to bring us back to thinking about those who are in power and how to get their attention about this. For instance, I'll just read it. Money is always an issue. It drives almost every decision on every level of the government, business, and community. What do you think it will take pragmatically for those in power internationally to take notice of the ecological terrorism and the migrations that emerge from it? In other words, what ways, viscerally, financially, and other means, to get in the faces of those in power do you propose will push these folks and the institutions they compromise to acknowledge and change their actions toward preventing and mitigating the effects of climate change?
I think that's a hugely important issue, and it's obviously a debate which the movements are having at the moment, particularly as we come out of this pandemic. As we're speaking, there are indigenous activists outside the White House demanding that Enbridge Line 3 be shut down of the Biden administration. So, folks are putting their bodies on the line. there and in many other parts of the world. Andreas Malm has a very interesting book recently called How to Blow Up a Pipeline, where he suggests that the sort of tacit acceptance of the idea that nonviolent direct action is the way to go for the climate movement needs to be put in question, and we need to think about sabotage against fossil capitalist infrastructure as a way to go. I think that is something that is likely to be very much on people's minds. As I've been presenting in recent months, people keep asking me about that book and what I think of it. So, you know, I think strategically it's an important issue. And my response is usually, I think it's going to depend on what the strategic circumstances are of different movements in different places, but that we need to keep in mind that representations of previous struggles for liberation, you know, struggles against imperialism and other forms of violence, certainly were not solely forms of nonviolent action. And so, yeah, we live in extreme times, and it may be important to contemplate a whole variety of different tactics, from boycotts, as Anne mentioned, to strikes, to forms of sabotage where it's appropriate.
Thank you. Anyone who would like to add? Anu?
Yeah, I'm moving in a slightly different direction, but I want to say that it's related. I was really taken by your question, Esra, that this question of, you know, how to connect the people on the ground with these international kinds of movements, and also the things that a few people brought up, but Ashley brought up in the very beginning, of how do we make a figuration of the climate refugee? How does that become a seeable person, a person who we can, you know, sense with and feel? And I keep coming up with these two questions about, I just keep coming up against the nation state. And I find myself again and again really thinking that all of these movements and activities that we're talking about have very highly varied relationships to the nation state. Anne says the Maldives are drowning. The Maldives has a very different relationship to itself as a nation state than those who have co-constructed the Red New Deal in North America, and the United States government itself and the Green New Deal. These are all really varied ways of thinking with what is effectively a really concrete instrument for starting to see things and understand something like a climate refugee. And so I sort of wanted to think about how we make a new language around this refugee, to give this refugee a status. It's something that I know Bronwyn brought up, and I mean, everyone in a way has been talking around. But one of the things I think you've done in this panel is make it possible to unseat older ways of understanding expertise and lift up newer ways of understanding expertise on something that has been technocratic for so long, and something that also has been assumed to be juridical in a certain way. And I think, in fact, some of the task here is to use the academy in exactly this way. And this is the academy, as far as I can see, is the only space that can do this with this kind of authority, is really make a new language around this refugee. That is the way that I think these things come into law and come into being, and also come into kind of aesthetic being, so that they can be seen. I don't know if that was clear, but it is something that keeps coming back to me in this entire conversation.
Oh, thank you so much. Anyone? Bronwyn? Go ahead.
Yeah, go ahead. I can wait. Yeah.
No, go ahead, please.
Thanks. I guess the way I come at this question, and I know there's another question for me in the chat about the Refugee Law Convention, which I appreciate. Thank you for that. I mean, I think I see it a little bit differently, and I think I see these questions, and my approach to these topics comes from where I live, and I live in a place where we are ground zero for the massive warehouse expansion that is associated with the logistics industry. In all the residential areas around my home and where kids are going to school have been rezoned to make space for these massive warehouses in places where children already have like 30 to 50% asthma rates in the local schools. They're not respecting requests like the buffer zone rules. It's it's a situation where in the day-to-day life, these things were justified as a basis for jobs in a context where it was already evident that they were going to roboticize, automate these warehouses as soon as they possibly could. We didn't know at the time that the workers were going to be denied protections during COVID. And so I've watched my neighbors die during this time period. And I've watched people see that and they really don't care. Honestly, they don't care. And I think people do see. And I think that the masks are off in a lot of ways. And I think that this is a time when we as scholars who are trained in critical theory traditions have a challenge of what do we do when debunking is no longer the task that people see clearly what they're doing. Jeff Bezos knows that his workers are dying, that they weren't even given masks by Amazon. And I don't know. I mean, so I think that it's a really interesting question to ask. From my perspective, the question about how law works in this context, and I know this is unsatisfying for a question about the refugee protection, but I think that we need to think about not just addressing the limits of law, but to think about the tools that we have at our disposal as double-edged swords in this context, that law is a double-edged sword and it shapes, we have to think about the stories that people are telling to prevent themselves from seeing the things that they see. It's not that things are necessarily invisible anymore, but that there are barriers that people are putting up to their sight. And legal frameworks can be a barrier, but they can also be wielded as an important tool. And the people that I've worked with in environmental justice struggles in the area, very differently from human rights activists, they understand that legal protections are a tool. They're not the end point. They're a useful tool, but they're a tool that can get in the way if we don't understand their limitations. And so I think with the Refugee Convention, like many things, it's going to be limited, and that if it's a stronger tool with those limitations, maybe those limitations are okay. But the question is, how do we link the legal to the political, in my view? That's the bigger question. And I'll stop there.
Thank you so much. Anne?
Yeah, I wanted to add just a point about that it seems that so much of effective strategic action at the forefront are Indigenous communities and beginning affiliations with Black communities as well. And I'm wondering if the question is really whether to get the attention of those in power, because I feel that they already know it, they're already watching. And if you think of something like Standing Rock as being inspired by a teenage girl, 10,000 people gather, and the kinds of successful protests that have taken place, even in Canada, to block pipelines. But the response to it has been so brutal, so militarized, and at a legislative level, you've got ALEC, American Legislative Exchange Council, with the Critical Infrastructure Bill, which sounds like the most innocuous. I have to, sorry, just put on my, connect my electricity. speaking of energy, but that Alec is just passing stealthily from state to state the critical infrastructure bill, which means that if you even inadvertently walk on land that is adjacent to some kind of power station, you are liable for 10 to 20 years in prison, massive felony charges. And so they are fully aware of what's going on. And I think one of the great challenges for us now is how do we make ALEC more visible? How do we counter the kind of legislation that is passing so quietly from state to state? How do we counter people who are environmental activists being put on terrorist bills? And we're seeing it move to the UK with the way the police are cracking down on protests around sexual assault. So one of the things I would want to say for us in the academy, and it shouldn't be the academy, but maybe we need to leave the academy. And I was so struck by Anuradha's presentation, because there was something so enormously present and grounded, Anuradha, in your presentation and in your photographs, that for us, that Indigenous people are doing it already. And we could learn to spend time with other communities and provide our resources to connect those communities with each other. But I would love to hear from other people, what do we do about the kind of radically autocratic and I think extraordinarily dangerous legislation against any form of protest that is being rolled out? I'd love to hear what people think about that.
Yeah, thank you so much for bringing even more questions. I mean, I realize we are already way past our time, and this has already been almost 3 hours. I think all of us knew that this won't be a conclusive discussion or a comforting discussion or something, or even a satisfactory, in the sense that, you know, in the sense of not knowing the answers for the moment. I think we all came to this panel with those expectations, and I would like to thank everyone for this enormous effort, your time and your presentations, which I hope is only one of the beginnings and will continue to go on. So thank you so much for your presentations. To be continued.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
Bye. Bye-bye.
Thanks, y'all.
Thank you so
Thank
much,
you.
everyone.
Bye.